الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So we haven't been together since the last Sunday in Ramadan. Is that what it was? The one before that, because Sunday was Eid. And when we left off, we had started towards the end of the last story that was mentioned, which is Dhul Qarnayn, and we had covered at least two of the journeys, right? So two of the journeys were covered. Do you guys remember? I can't remember who was here, I'll be honest. I know you were here, ya Sheikh. Is that right? You were. What did we talk about? What did we talk about? So we said he had how many travels? 3, right? 3 journeys. One to the... No. Sheikh. Maghrib al-Shams, Matla' al-Shams. One to the... Maghrib is what? West. And one to the east. We also talked about why he's called Dhul Qarnayn. Do you guys remember any of that? Should I give a quick summary? So when we start talking about Dhul Qarnayn, we said that it has to do with the test of having rulership or kingdomship. Okay, that's the tribulation of it. So it's a trial of power, essentially. And when we mentioned why the story was over here, because the people of Quraysh wanted to test the Prophet ﷺ to prove that he's not a prophet, and so they went to the people of the book, the Jews, and they said, how can we test him? And they said, ask him these 3 questions. If he answered 2, then he's a prophet. If he answered 3, then he's not a prophet. And those 3 questions were, what is the story of Musa, right, Al-Khadr? What is the story? Sorry, the story of the cave, the fiction of the cave, the story of Dhul Qarnayn, and the story of, what is the question about Ar-Ruh, right, Ar-Ruh, the soul. And so 2 of them were answered in Surah Al-Kahf, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala added 2 more stories. And Ar-Ruh was in another surah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ. They ask you about the soul. قُلُ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي. It is a order from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is a creation from Allah. Okay? And so the 2 stories that were mentioned, so they asked about Dhul Qarnayn and the people of the cave. And so those are the first and last story. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned 2 other stories in the middle. The story of the one that had the 2 gardens, and the story of Musa and Al-Khadr. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even added more, right? More stories that they didn't ask for because they had messages associated with it. Now, this is why we are at the last one that we talk about, the Dhul Qarnayn. And I think I mentioned last time, is one of the beautiful things about the Quran is to notice how interactive it is during the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Quran is very interactive. Quite often the Prophet would be asked questions, and the Quran would come down and says, يَسْأَلُونَك, they ask you. Right? And so he would respond. And this shows that the Quran is not from the Prophet ﷺ, but it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because whatever kind of question that Prophet ﷺ is being asked through 23 years, there is consistency in the style of revelation. There's consistency in answers. Nothing contradicts one another. And that's humanly impossible. Right, especially when you're always being pressured to answer questions. And so when we're talking about Surah Al-Qarnayn, we mentioned, it was the reason it's a test, why the trial of power is a test or kingdomship, is because when you have complete power, they say complete power? You guys know the statement? Complete power corrupts absolutely? Like absolute power corrupts absolutely. Have you heard that before? Yes? No? Am I just saying things when I was... All right. They taught us in school, in history, that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Okay? That is a true statement, but also not completely true. Because absolute power to a righteous individual does not corrupt them. Does it make sense? But it's a source of fitna, because when you feel that, when you have complete control over everything, it is very difficult not to abuse it for self-gain, right? Not to abuse it to fulfill your own desires, and so forth. This is why it is a very, it's a strong fitna. It's a very hard test, because nobody's questioning you, nobody's holding you accountable. And now we also mentioned, we talked about Dhul Qarnayn, why he was called Dhul Qarnayn. And it means the one with the two horns, essentially. We mentioned why that. It was mentioned, like, we said that he was called that because Al-Qarn over here, like, the two ends, is referring to the east and the west, the travels. So he traveled between the east and west, as called that. Or that he possessed the kingdomship over the two largest nations at that time, so the two ends of nations. But it's also mentioned that it might be because of the type of crown that he'd wear, the Vikings, something like that. Others said that it's because of how he would dress his hair. So it'd be two braids. In Arabic it's called qarn, right? Or the fa'ir would be called qurun. But whatever the reason is, Allah alam, which one of is true, but this is why he was called Dhul Qarnayn. Some people claimed he's a specific individual, but not necessarily. So some people thought he was Cyrus the Great. Others think that he's Alexander the Great, but none of that holds true. Because there's no evidence for that. We just know that he is a righteous individual. He's not a prophet. He's an individual that is righteous. And we mentioned that his first journey was to the east, right? Are you with me? His first journey to the east, right? Tell me yes or no. Yes? No, you're wrong. What did we say at the beginning of the class? To the west. طيب. I think I'm going to have to ask you to summarize after I summarize. So his first journey was to the west. He journeyed until he reached an area where the sun sets, okay, where he saw it. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him the option of how to treat those individuals. And he showed that how just he was in terms of treating individuals. He did not treat the disbeliever similar to the believer, even after giving him da'wah and giving him a chance and so forth. And so one, he gave glad tidings. The other one, he mentioned that there is a punishment. And then he journeyed all the way to the Matla' al-Shams, where the sun elevates and nothing's concealed. These people had nothing to conceal them. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that similarly he did what he had to do with them. And we are at the third and last journey of the Qarnayn, which is where he reached between the Bayn al-Saddayn, right? Between the two mountains or a valley, right? Now, it is interesting to note that the story of the Qarnayn, over here, this is where the whole thing about Ya'juj and Ma'juj, right? In English, what's it called? Huh? Say that again? Yes, in English. Gog and Magog, right? Or Agog and Magog, or whatever it is. It is mentioned, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that in the Quran. Okay, He mentioned in the Quran. This story was not mentioned in the Bible. Like the meeting of the Qarnayn with them was not mentioned in the Bible. Now, why am I mentioning this? Is because there's always a claim and accusation that the Prophet ﷺ is simply copying previous scriptures. Although, that claim does not hold water, because one, the Prophet ﷺ cannot read a different language, let alone read Arabic. He was unlettered. And two, nobody ever taught him what is in the previous scriptures. But even that being said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed in the Quran information, right? So for example, Ya'juj and Ma'juj were in the Bible, but that meeting of the Qarnayn with the people who were suffering from Ya'juj and Ma'juj was not mentioned. So this is added information, as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling them, you don't have all knowledge, here is knowledge, true knowledge, and I'm fixing incorrect information you have, and you ask certain questions, here are the answers. Wallahu alam. Tayyib. The other thing I want you kind of to look at as we're going through the story of Dhul Qarnayn is I want you to notice that obviously he was a king, and so really what he's doing, he's roaming his kingdomship, like his land, and he was essentially what he's doing is he's catering to the needs of his subjects. Because the only way that any individual would understand what his subject needs is to mingle with them. or at least have some sort of a methodology to receive what their needs are in reality. And over here, Dhul Qarnayn was an individual who he himself went out and roamed the land to be able to do what he, as best as he can as a king, to cater to the needs of his subjects. All right, so he traveled until he came to a group of people that lived between two mountains. Right, they lived between two mountains. There's a valley, they live in a valley. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, حتى إذا بلغ بين السدين وجد من دونهما قوما لا يكادون يفقهون قولا. So he found a group of individuals, and he described it, said, كادوا لا يفقهون قولا, which means they almost barely understood anything. Right? They did not comprehend. But what that points out to, as like, in terms of how he described them, is that these are individuals that lived so remotely, right? They were very remote, that nobody understood them, right? That nobody understood them because of their dialect, their language. Like, they're so far away from other civilizations, and so they didn't understand others that came to them, and other that, like, they didn't understand the language of others, and others that came to visit them didn't quite understand what they meant. So كادوا لا يفقهون قولا فقالوا يا ذا القرنين. But then the Quran mentions, they said, they spoke to Dhul Qarnayn and they relayed information. So how is it that the Dhul Qarnayn was able to understand them? If it's a language, like, that they're unable to communicate with, there's a lack of communication. There's a gap in communication. So how was Dhul Qarnayn able to understand them? Can you just take a guess? Pictures. No, I like sign language. Okay, maybe perhaps sign language, right? Abdullah ibn Abbas, it was mentioned in the books of tafsir that Abdullah ibn Abbas said that he had to resort to a vast number of translators so that he would be able to piece together what they were saying. He didn't just give up and move along. He understood that they wanted something, that they needed something, because they were seeking his help. Like, when he passed by, they seemed like individuals that were in dire need of something. They kept trying to ask him something. And so he understood that, so he didn't just ignore them and move along and say, like, as they get myself in trouble, right? If you can't speak our language, just find another country, right? Does that sound familiar? He didn't do that, right? They're still my subjects, right? They have a need. I'll do everything in my power to, like, to figure out what they want. And so that's what Qarnayn did. So I'm saying this so you can understand what kind of king he was, right? And so instead, like, so he still, with whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him with capabilities, he utilized what he had with him to figure out how to communicate with these individuals that were remotely living very far. Now, one thing we understand, as they said, قالوا إن يأجوج ومأجوج مفسدون في الأرض. Right? So they said Ya'juj and Ma'juj have spread corruption in the land, and this tells us that this group that was living in that valley were a group of individuals that were oppressed. Right? They were being oppressed by Ya'juj and Ma'juj. That they are individuals that were weak. They didn't exactly have military power or strength or anything like that. They were very, individuals that were incapable of fending for themselves, essentially. They were constantly being raided by Ya'juj and Ma'juj, being slaughtered, killed, stolen from, whatever the case is. And so they needed, they needed the help. And so in order to try to convince Dhul Qarnayn to help them, what did they do? What did they offer to do? So first of all, what did they say they wanted? Yeah, how? قالوا إن يأجوج ومأجوج مفسدون في الأرض فهل تجعل لنا? Build a what? A barrier between us and them, right? فهل نجعل لك خرجا على أن تجعل بيننا وبينهم سدا. They said, we're going to offer you, essentially pay you, so that you'd build a barrier. Okay? So obviously they knew what they needed to do. Is that right? Why didn't they do it? True. They didn't have the capabilities, knowledge, right, of what to do. Because quite often, sometimes, even as in our daily lives or throughout our life, we know that we need to do something. We know what the solution is. We know what we have to do, but we might not know necessarily how to do it or have the capability of doing it. Say that again? That's why what? You call who? You could also consult Sheikh Google, Sheikh. Actually, don't do that, okay? Then, like, Sheikh, you told us to do it on our own. I ruined my house. Who's going to pay for it now? Call a plumber, okay? طيب. Actually, in this country, Sheikh, you have to be a plumber and everything, an electrician, a counselor, I saw the funniest clip, which is true, right? Sorry, this is a sidetrack. I apologize. But I thought it was kind of interesting because just tailoring to the things, like multiple things you need to know. So this was a guy, like, he's he's kind of relaying a message through doing an act, right? He's a juggler. And so he said, like, when I was young, I, like, high school, going to college, right? I realized I need to get a job. And so he picked up a pen and he's just throwing it, right? Which is, like, trying to work out of my job, save a lot of money, right? And then, like, what it actually was? Oh, so he got a job, right? Or go to college, I can't remember which one it was. So anyway, a job, okay? And then he said, actually, was it a job or education? Well, one of them, I think, like, he wanted to go to school, and then he realized he needed a job, right? So he's going to school, focusing on it, then he needed a job, and so he's, like, he's holding, like, juggling two things. He's trying to balance, like, job and school, right? And then he said, I got married, and now he's juggling three things, okay? And he's like, I'm trying to focus, I'm trying to balance, I'm trying to focus, I'm trying to balance. And he's like, then I got kids. And now he's juggling what? Four things, right? He's like, now I have to be like a caregiver, a parent, a counselor, a plumber, like an electrician, because he has a house now, right? And he's got to be a social worker. He's doing all these things, okay? And then he's like, and then my family's asking and complaining, I don't have time for them. He's like, because I don't have time, right? But anyway, that's the sidetrack, just being a plumber and knowing all these other things. I'm sorry, it triggered mind works in interesting ways. Back to our story, right? Dhul Qarnayn was juggling a lot of stuff though, right? But subhanAllah, Allah gave him success to do that. So they knew what they needed, but you don't necessarily have the knowledge or the capability of doing it, which tells us that for us to succeed in life, we not just have to know what we need to do, but we should also need to know how to do it and have the means to do it. How did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describe Dhul Qarnayn? وَأَتَيْنَاهُ مِن كُلِّ شَيْءٍ سَبَبًا. We gave him means. فَأَتْبَعَ سَبَبًا. So he followed those means. And so obviously Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also gave him knowledge. This is how we're going to be able to succeed. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that each individual of us, as an independent individual, needs to have the knowledge, the skills, and the means. That's not humanly possible. But we're able to do it if we collaborate, right? That collaboration is important. If we're ever to succeed as an ummah, we need to understand we need that collaboration. We have to get out of that mentality of I can do everything on my own. I'm the one and only person that can do this and no one but me. We're lying to ourselves, right? We're human beings. We have our limitations. We need to make sure that we're able to successfully collaborate and utilize everybody's skills, knowledge, and efforts, and to trust one another that our objective is to build whatever is best for our society. Okay? طيب. So Dhul Qarnayn responded to them, right? So remember, they offered him money to do something. So what did he say? Did he accept that offer from them? No. He said, مَا مَكَّنِّي فِيهِ رَبِّي خَيْرٌ. What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave me is better. Now, some people, when they find others in need, what do? Huh? They take advantage of that need, right? They take advantage of that need. It's sad to say that this entire economical system is built on taking advantage of people's needs. All these, mortgages, loans, they're what are they doing? They're taking advantage of those that needed to survive, right? And it's one of the worst things you can ever do, right? Take advantage of those who are in need. But Dhul Qarnayn over here, he did not take advantage of their needs, right? To take away their wealth, he said, okay, I'll take everything. Ya'juj and Ma'juj raids you anyway. Might as well, I'm better off taking it. If I don't take it, somebody else will take it. It's almost like they're justifying. It makes no sense. I'm going to rob you. If I don't rob you, somebody else will rob you. You're going to get robbed anyway. Might as well me do it. Right? Does that sound familiar? If nobody's going to take your land, if I don't take your land, somebody else will take your land. Somebody else will take it. Right? If I don't do it, somebody else will do it. That's one of the worst arguments ever. Like you're justifying what is wrong, like morally wrong. But anyway, he didn't, subhanAllah wa ta'ala, he said, مَا مَكَّنِّي فِيهِ رَبِّي خَيْرٌ. Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave me possession over is better. But then he said, فَأَعِينُونِي بِقُوَّةٍ. Yes. Say it again. No, Dhul Qarnayn is not a prophet. But anyway, so he said, فَأَعِينُونِي بِقُوَّةٍ. Right? فَأَعِينُونِي بِقُوَّةٍ. He said, support me with your strength. Right? فَأَعِينُونِي بِقُوَّةٍ أَجْعَلْ بَيْنَكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ رَدْمًا. So they requested a sad, he gave them a radm. So a sad is the barrier, a radm is a dam. Okay? Which is more? He dams more, right? And so he didn't just tell them, I'm going to help you, but he gave them even something that is better. But the question is, why to teach them, you mean? Okay. That's a valid reason. So them not to become dependable. That is true. So they'd be able to work. But there's a very important, there's a very important psychological, humanistic aspect to this. Because if you ever had a kid, you'd experience this. Do kids expect their parents to do everything for them? Yeah. Let's be honest. Yes. Right? طيب. When their parents constantly give their things to their kids, or they do things for them, how much value do these kids give whatever they obtained? Zero. Most parents, they get upset. They're like, why are you doing this with this thing? Don't you understand how many hours I worked to for example, get the money to do this? Or whatever, how much, a pain I had to go through to do this? What is ever obtained easily is not appreciated. What is obtained easily is never appreciated. When it takes time and effort to obtain something, it is valued. It is. But this also teaches us the importance of delayed gratification, not immediate gratification. This is a concept that is very distant from our mind in our modern world. Everything right now is, immediate, right? Scrolling, firing of the hormones in our mind all the time, right? Dopamine receptors just firing, and then you get bored, you move to something else. That constant gratification is not a good thing because we no longer value things anymore. When we get things so easily, it's not valued. But when you work so hard for a long period of time, you understand its value. You take care of it. And so perhaps, Wallahu A'lam, Dhul Qarnayn made them help him so that they understand the value associated with what had happened. Right? Wallahu A'lam. طيب. And so he said, فَعِنُوا بِقُوَّةٍ أَجْعَلْ بَيْنَكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ سَدًّا. And it's almost like there's a depiction of what's happened. He said, آتوني زبر الحديد. Right? Bring to me the fragments or chunks or pieces of iron. Okay? Iron. Now, where's iron found? On the surface of the earth? So what did they have to do? They had to dig it out. They had to work, right? And so they had to really work. And it's said that they gathered so much of it that the height of it was meant to not just cover half the height of the valley, but it was all the way up until the peak of that mountain where they're at. Okay, so it kind of piled up to that much. And then he told them, أتوني زبر الحديد ثم قال انفخوا حتى إذا جعله نارا. And then he told them to create a fire. What's meant to? Why was the fire required? To melt it, because it's pieces, right? You wanna essentially merge it together, right? You want to see, instead of being pieces, that you want to. I don't want to use the word solder. Solder is not actually. It is the correct word. I guess almost solder them together, melt them to create a wall, and not just that. But then he said, ثم أتوني أفرغ عليه قطرة. Right? قطرة is molten brass. Right? So after all this, he told them to pour on it molten brass. What's the point of doing that? Reinforce, but also seal any sort of gaps. Okay? Seal any sort of gaps. So one, he gave them better than what they wanted, but also the way it was constructed, it took time to build. He asked them to do it. And after it was done built, it was very fortified. Okay? Which means Ya'juj and Ma'juj could not come to that land. They couldn't. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فَمَا اسْتَطَاعُوا لَهُ فَمَا اسْتَطَاعُوا لَهُ فَمَا اسْتَطَاعُوا أَن يَظْهَرُوهُ وَمَا اسْتَطَاعُوا لَهُ نَقْبًا. Now, we mentioned this before. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فَمَا اسْتَطَاعُوا أَن يَظْهَرُوهُ, which they couldn't climb over it. وَمَا اسْتَطَاعُوا لَهُ نَقْبًا, and they couldn't go through it. Over here, the first one is اسْتَطَاعُوا, the second is اسْتَطَاعُوا. You guys remember, we mentioned this before. What's the difference? They both mean couldn't. But what's the difference between ista'u and istata'u? No. We did this last time, Shaykh, and you're correct. You gave the answer. It's the number of letters used. Ista'u, istata'u. Type. If you need to pull the verse, actually I don't know what verse number it is. Huh? Shaykh, the word itself, ista'u and istata'u, what's the difference? Same meaning, but what's the difference? That's what it means. It's true. But how do we understand that? How do you get that from? No. فَمَا اسْتَطَاعُوا أَن يَظْهَرُوهُ وَمَا اسْتَطَاعُوا لَهُ نَقْبًا. The difference between them is just the number of letters used. And the first one is how many letters? Alif, Sin, Ta, Ain, Alif, Waw, Alif, right? 7. And the other one is, the only difference is what? Instead of saying ista'u, it said istata'u. So it's 8. One letter difference, right? And in the Arabic language, they say زيادة المبنى يؤدي إلى زيادة معنى, which means that an increase in numbers is an increase in meaning. So letters. So over here, it's reflecting one is more difficult than the other. So it would be easy for them to climb over it as opposed to try to go through it. Okay? طيب. It is more difficult to kind of try to dig through a iron and brass as opposed to try to climb it. But they still could not climb it anyway. We're talking about the level of difficulty anyway. But they couldn't climb it because maybe perhaps it was just there's no way they can hold on to anything. If they can't even puncture it, they can't put things to kind of use to climb. So either way, they could not do it. But one is obviously more difficult than the other. Wallahu a'lam. طيب. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, قال هذا رحمة من ربي. Right? قال هذا رحمة من ربي. So after he was done, he did not say, look at my fine art of work. Right? Look at my efforts. Right? What have I accomplished? Congratulate me. Right? Did he do that? Even though sometimes we do that, by the way. Right? Graduation, when people graduate, what do? They're happy with their accomplishments. Okay? But is it you really? Or is it from the mercy of Allah? This is why he said, ذَلِكَ رَحْمَةٌ مِّن رَبِّي. This is a mercy from my Lord. So he returned all that to the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he didn't say it was me. He said it was from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's important as Muslims. We need to understand that whatever we have, in the end, it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that gave us the intellect, the strength, and desire to do it. Without that, He instilled that into us. We didn't just bring it and with our sheer effort put it into us. Allah created this with us. And so this should humble us, always humble us, and realize that we need to thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His blessings upon us. So ذَلِكَ رَحْمَةٌ مِّن رَبِّي فَإِذَا جَاءَ وَعْدُ رَبِّي جَعَلَهُ دَكَّةً وَكَانَ وَعْدُ رَبِّي حَقًّا. But He also informed them that, other than saying that this is from the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He gave me the ability and the capabilities and the resources and so forth, He told them that there is essentially an expiration date to this dam, which is when the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes, which is when? Towards the day of the end of time, right? This is when the major signs of the day of judgment happens, and Ya'juj and Ma'juj come out. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَهُم مِّن كُلِّ حَدَبٍ يَنْسِلُونَ. They're coming from every side, like they're pouring down from every side. Now, as we're going with this, does this surah indicate that Dhul Qarnayn engaged in some sort of a battle against them? No. Because apparently Ya'juj and Ma'juj are a group of humans that no other human is capable of fighting against them. Because their sheer numbers is great, but also perhaps Allah Alam, their body strength capabilities, Allah Alam. Some people may ask, how can we not have discovered it? Satellites all over the place, Google Maps. We don't see no dams or anything like that. Some people thought it was the Mongols. Some people think it's the Great Wall of China. No, it's none of that, right? Until this day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is capable of all things. They have not been discovered. And that shouldn't be astonishing. Only in recent history, they still seem to find lost tribes hiding in the jungle where nobody found them before, right? So why is this surprising? Even though with the satellites, they didn't pick up anything. So it's not surprising that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if He wills to do something, He'll do it, right? And for example, the people of Musa alayhi salam, He made them be lost in Sinai for 40 years. If you want to think about it, if they should walk in a straight line, they'll get out of it, right? Doesn't matter which, east, west, north, south, it makes no difference. If you just walk in a straight line, you'll get out of that territory. But still, they were lost for 40 years. This is the capability of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah is capable of doing anything He desires. And so this is something as we believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we understand it. طيب. Now those people who say science is advanced and so forth, this is a bit of arrogance. No matter how much we advance, our capabilities are still limited. You have to understand that. طيب. There's a hadith I'm going to mention of Ya'juj and Ma'juj, how they're going to come out, just to kind of complement the story, because حتى إذا جاء وعد ربي جعله دكة, which means a collapse. وكان وعد ربي حقا. And my promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is truth. This is referring to the end of time, one of the major signs of the day of judgment. How many major signs are there? I think we're going to have to do a class about this now. What are the signs of the day of judgment? Major signs. 10. There's 10 of them. Okay? There's 10 of those major signs. Okay? One of them is Ya'juj and Ma'juj. Some of them will come very close to each other. That is Ad-Dajjal, Isa ibn Maryam, Ya'juj and Ma'juj. That's later on, Shaykh. That's true. And then the beast that comes out, right? We don't know which one will come first. But anyway, Abu Hurairah, he narrated the Prophet said that he's talking about Ya'juj and Ma'juj. They're obviously they're stuck behind a wall, and they want to get out. So what do they do every day? Try to dig through it. Okay, and so the Prophet said the Ya'juj and Ma'juj, they try to dig through the barrier, through the dam every day, until they almost are able to see the rays of the sun. And so the one who's in charge of them, who's telling them to dig and giving them instruction, he says, go back, we'll continue tomorrow, right? We'll dig tomorrow. And so then they come back tomorrow, and it was sealed back again. More difficult than before. Until the time that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills that they'll come out reaches, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants them to come out. As they dig, they'll dig, continue dig until they almost see the rays of the sun. And the person who's, their leader, who's in charge of, dictating what they're supposed to do, he says, go back, and inshallah you'll come back and you'll dig tomorrow. The minute he said inshallah, the next day when they came back, it was as it is, and they were able to dig through it and come out. Okay. Now, and the Prophet ﷺ mentions, in this hadith and several different hadith combinations, is that they will come out after the descent of Isa ibn Maryam, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and of course after the death of the Dajjal, the Prophet, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would reveal to Prophet Isa, he said that I have released some of my creation that nobody can fight against. Take the Muslims and the believers and hide in the mountains, Jabal al-Tur, the one that Musa alayhi salam received the revelation. He said, climb and stay on top of it. And so the Ya'juj and Ma'juj will come out in large and huge numbers, right? Like large, really large numbers. And because of their vastness, and they actually, it is mentioned that they'll pass by a body of water. And by the time the last one passes by it, he will say there used to be a body of water here, because they drank all of it. And they'll scour the earth, killing everything that they can see. And they would say, we have killed everybody in the earth. Now it's time to kill people, whoever is in the heavens. And so they will, with their arrows, they'll try to shoot in the sky. And by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He'll allow it to come back bloodied. And they'll say, we've killed the people in the heavens. When this happens, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would eliminate all of them by sending some sort of a disease upon them, a plague. Right? And they will all die. And so what strength do they have? They couldn't fend themselves. They just completely died. However, their corpses are just rotting in the earth. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would send birds would have long necks that will carry them through somewhere else, and rain that will come down to purify the earth. And that will be the end of, Ya'juj and Ma'juj. Okay? طيب. So, that being said, this is essentially the total story of Dhul Qarnayn. What are the lessons, or what is it that we can do to overcome and survive that fitna of power? So what did Dhul Qarnayn do to be able to overcome this fitna? And as we're saying this, you have to remember, none of us are prone to this, none of them are prone to this fitna. One of my friends, he was talking about Egyptians. But it's true to everybody, right? He was just having a discussion, he made a joke. He said, in every one of you, there's a small Fir'aun, just waiting to get out. It's true for almost everybody. There's that small, oppressive, individual or thing in us that is waiting to get out if it has a chance. And we see that the minute that we have control over others or power, what do we do with it? And so we have to be very careful. So what did Dhul Qarnayn do? What did you say you mentioned? What did he do? How did he overcome this fitna? Help others. Just others, or is it, we're talking about his subjects, those who were under him. So how did he view himself? So he viewed himself as, you serve me or I serve you. He's serving people, right? He has a job and a role. That role is that you cater to your subjects. You are doing things for them. So in reality, you are serving the people. They're not serving you. Yes, it's true for you to be able to do your job. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave that person or that individual specific rights, okay? A limited amount of power that they need to be able to fulfill their roles. And by the way, this is in any role that's in charge. I'll give an example. This is how we understand, for example, the husband, who is mainly supposed to be the head of the family, why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them specific, or that male, the father, the husband, specific rights, because that's necessary to be able to lead the family, to be able to take the responsibility and serve those who are underneath him. Does it make sense? Because if that father or the head of the family or the husband says, okay, for the betterment of my family, we should do this, and they say, no, we don't feel like it, is this family gonna survive? If they say, you have to take our opinions, and it doesn't matter your opinion, right? Or that, you need to do things outside and inside and sideways and upside, and essentially you become like whatever the case is, there's no power. You have to do everything, and there's no authority. Authority is given equal to the responsibility. And so when you look at these positions of power, they're positions of responsibility, liability. They're not positions of, luxury. Does it make sense? In whatever position it is, it doesn't matter. If you're given a position of leadership, that there's people that you're responsible for are underneath you, that is a responsibility that you will be questioned about. And so Dhul Qarnayn did not view that he is being served, but he is serving, wallahu alam. This is why he scoured the earth, right? And he did whatever he needed to help people and establish justice and so forth. So you said helping others, that's that framework. What else? Thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which means that to be thankful, you have to acknowledge the bounties of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is not from you. That's different than who? Possess and have, right? This is the opposite of what you're supposed to do. So over here, Dhul Qarnayn, what he did, he admitted the bounties of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so he was thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like, what else is there? How do you survive this fitna? Not what? Not taking advantage. How do you do that? Increase your wealth. Sheikh, I'm asking, so what did you say? So you're saying not taking advantage of your position. I said, how you do that? You said increase your wealth? Sheikh, what makes a person not abuse their power? Not become a politician. You're mistaken. You think that it's just being a politician, but the head of a family can abuse their power. The CEO can abuse their power. The president of any institution can abuse their power. Is that right? So it's not limited to, of course, we're talking about different hierarchy. Of course, the prime minister, the president, the king is, the top of the food chain. And then there's different ranks, okay, all the way until the individual household. But how do you not take advantage of that? Good, we talked about believe that everything comes from Allah, but there's two other factors that are really important sometimes we have to remember, right? One is to remember that the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is true, and that there's a day of judgment, and that we'll be asked about what we have done with that responsibility. There's a questioning that's going to happen, that you're liable, which means that you will be questioned, held accountable. There's accountability. So that's one factor. The other is ikhlas, sincerity, which is to ask yourself, why am I doing what I'm doing? Why am I doing what I'm doing? What's the purpose of it? What's the objective? Why am I doing it? Is it to fulfill my needs and desire, or is it to fulfill my role? Right? Is it for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or self-gain? Is it to attain Jannah or for worldly gains? So this is sincerity. When you do it all for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and every time you ask the question, why am I doing this? The answer is to fulfill my role, my duties that Allah has placed upon me. Then you are assessing your state yourself, and you're keeping yourself in check. And so that is another factor that's important. Okay. The other one that's important is to humble yourself. Somebody mentioned that, right? To humble yourself, that is true. And so you don't take advantage of your position. You're not up on your high horse. You're off your high horse. Right? And so you're down with everybody else. And so that is one of the other things. But one other thing that's important for us to overcome this tribulation of power is to, like Dhul Qarnayn, to make sure that we are as just as we can, that we're fair as much as we can, based on the Quran and the Sunnah, based on what Allah has legislated. That's a very important factor. Right? This is where it comes down to, is that, like, this is how we overcome some of those things. But in that process also, like, we're talking about, the Quran, when he's obviously doing a lot of righteous deeds. But so is one of the things that we can do is to increase the amount of good deeds that we do, right, and along that path, and to utilize our power to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to perform more good deeds. Essentially, this is how we can able to overcome that tribulation of power. Okay? So what time is it? Type. So we're left with the last page of Surah Al-Kahf. We can conclude today, like we can finish it today. You guys okay with that? Yes? Type. So that last page, actually, you know what? Here's my question. We're talking about the 4 tribulations. Okay? What is the link between, so now we just finished all, we said that, so what, do you guys remember what the 4 tribulations are? It's tribulation in your, or test in your, the first one is what? In your religion, in your faith. The second one is a test in? No. Wealth. Okay? Tribulation of wealth. The third is knowledge. And the last one is power. Okay? What does that have to do with the Dajjal? You know what the Prophet ﷺ said, reading Surah Al-Kahf, will protect you from Dajjal? What's the connection between this and that? How? So his answer is that the Dajjal will test us in all these, he'll come with these 4 tests. So how is that? So how does that test our deen? Like what if somebody says, if a scholar comes in and he'll tell you, let me lead you to the straight path, and he teaches you Quran and Sunnah, is that bad? Is that a test? طيب, how do you know it's the wrong direction, Shaykh? What's the Dajjal going to ask people to do? Worship him. Excellent. He's going to claim to be God, and he's going to ask them to worship him. That's a tribulation in your faith. Okay? Now, and then he's going to do other things. What are other things? How are the other, 3 come in? To prove that he's God, what he's going to do? Allah's going to give him the capability to do what? He's going to tell the sky to rain, and it rains, right? The green to grow, and it grows. The treasures to come out of the earth and follow him. That is a fitna in wealth. That's your fitna in wealth. Because essentially, if you do this, I'm going to give you that wealth. If you're not going to do, I'm going to take away. And so when a group of people don't obey him, he orders the earth to get its treasures, and he goes away with it. So now they're impoverished, right? And so that is a fitna in wealth. What about the fitna in knowledge? It's said that he's going to give them information, right, that they were not aware of, some sort of knowledge. And so that is the fitna in knowledge. Now, the last one, which is the fitna of power, how is that? Well, yeah, essentially he's gonna have rule over large pieces of territories and lands, because he's gonna scour the earth. The only place he's not gonna be able to enter is where? Mecca and Medina. Mecca and Medina. Wallahu a'lam. طيب. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the last page of the Surah Al-Kahf, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَتَرَكْنَا بَعْضَهُمْ يَوْمَئِذٍ يَمُوجُ فِي بَعْضٍ وَنُفِخَ فِي الصُّورِ فَجَمَعْنَاهُمْ جَمْعًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala moves from the scene of Ya'juj and Ma'juj. And he said, like, subhanahu wa ta'ala, he said, we leave them that day surging over each other. Like there's surging that's happening with people. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala switches immediately. So this is the sign of Day of Judgment, switches into the Day of Judgment. And this is وَنُفْخَ فِي الصُّورِ فَجَمَعْنَاهُمْ جَمْعًا. It's blown to the horn and we have gathered all of them. Who's all of them? All of creation, right? All of creation. And so it moved from Ya'juj and Ma'juj, one of the major signs of Day of Judgment, immediately to the Day of Judgment, the final abode, where justice will be established, where the righteous will be rewarded and the wicked will be punished. Right? Those who obeyed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be rewarded, those who disobeyed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be punished. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the horn will be blown and all of creation will be gathered. And this is a warning and a reminder that we constantly have to be focused on the hereafter and utilize our time in this world for the hereafter. That's that switch. If you notice, we're talking about wealth, power, knowledge, and then Day of Judgment. Right? That's the series of it. That's essentially our entire life. We're going to live through a test, and then the result is in the Day of Judgment. Right? SubhanAllah, it's a beautiful continuum of when we were first created. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned in the Quran, Iblis, right? He was there. He was there from the beginning, and the temptation of them, and all the tribulation of this earth, and it will end always with the Day of Judgment. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that that we will be presented. فَجَمَعْنَاهُمْ جَمْعًا وَعَرَضْنَا جَهَنَّمَ يَوْمَئِذٍ لِلْكَافِرِينَ عَرْضًا. Right? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He presented Jahannam to the people. In the other hadith, it's mentioned how it's going to be brought. It's going to be brought with chains, with 70,000 chains, and with each chain there's 70,000 angels dragging it, bringing it forth. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes those disbelievers. He said, الَّذِينَ كَانَتْ what? What's wrong with your eyes? You guys can pull the verses, okay? طيب. وعرضنا جهنم يومئذ الكافرين عرضا الذين كانت أعينهم في غطاء عن ذكري وكانوا لا يستطيعون سمعا. Right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that there's a barrier on their eyes and they couldn't hear. What does that mean? Are they blind and deaf? No, what does it mean then? Okay. So I like the ignored, deceived. Explain. I like that one. So there's a difference between hearing and listening. Hearing and listening. A lot of times when we get into arguments, we're talking to each other, but are we listening to each other? Not necessarily. Okay? So what it's pointing out, it means that these individuals were in a state of turning away from looking into the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His verses and pondering upon them. Like it was being presented, but they don't want to look at it. When the evidence is being told to them, they don't want to listen to it. They refuse to listen to the Quran and the evidences. They don't want to entertain that idea. And there's a reason behind that, because it entails that they're going to have to leave their whims and desires and follow orders, essentially, right? Or whether because they believe that they are right and everything else is wrong, not even entertaining the possibility or opening their minds to the possibility that there's something that is larger than them, that there's something that is more correct than what they are assuming as individuals, right? And so they're unable to respond to the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because they refuse to look into it or listen to it. Okay? And so then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from there, الذين كانت أعينهم في غطاء عن ذكري وكانوا يستطيعون السمع أولئك الذين حبطت أعمالهم ولا نقيم لهم يوم القيامة وزنا. Or no, wait, I'm missing a verse. الذين كفروا اتخذوا من دون أولياء إنا أعتدنا جهنم للكافرين نزلا. قل أنبئكم بالأخسرين أعمالا. Sorry, so I missed the verse, right? So the verse when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said الذين كانت عنهم في غطاء عن ذكري وكانوا لا يستطيعون سمعا أفحسب الذين كفروا أن يتخذوا عبادي من دوني أولياء. Do these believers think that would take, from my creation, like awliya, which is supporters? So it's referring to the disbelievers. Not just that, but also the people of the book, where they took some of the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and they worshipped them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, do you think that you take my creation? This is my creation. Right? Those creation that they're worshipping, that you are worshipping, are actually worshipping me. Right? You know, the people of Nuh, Qawm Nuh, they ended up worshipping Waddan wa Suwa'an wa Yaghutha wa Ya'uqa wa Nasra. Those were righteous individuals that worshipped Allah, but those individuals started worshipping them. And so the question is, why are you worshipping a creation that worships Allah? Aren't you thinking? Aren't you pondering? They're not independent. These are dependent. And so this is one of those things that talk about that you are not looking and you're not listening. طيب. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, قُلْ هَلْ نُنَبِّئُكُمْ بِالْأَخْسَرِينَ أَعْمَالًا. So should I not tell you, inform you of those who are in a state of loss in terms of their deed? الَّذِينَ ضَلَّ سَعْيُهُمْ فِي الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا وَهُمْ يَحْسَبُونَ أَنَّهُمْ يُحْسِنُونَ صُنْعًا. Right? And so this, we have to pay attention to this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing these individuals. Those are individuals that actually did and put effort and work. But all their work and effort is useless. لَنُقِمْ يَوْمِ الْقِيَامَةِ وَزْنًا. On the day of judgment, it has no weight. Right? It has no weight. وَهُمْ يَحْسَبُونَ أَنَّهُمْ يُحْسِنُونَ صُنْعًا. The issue is that they think that they are doing good. One of the worst things is that you are unaware that what you're doing is useless. That you think you're doing something that is magnificent and great. And in reality, it has no value. Right? May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from all this. أولئك الذين كفروا بآيات ربهم ولقائه فحبطت أعمالهم فلا نقيم اليوم القيامة وزنا. Those of them who have disbelieved in the verses of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and in His meetings. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala فحبطت أعمالهم, their deeds are habitat, which means they're not accepted, they're rejected. فلا نقيم اليوم القيامة وزنا ذلك جزاؤهم بما كفروا. So there's no weight to them in the day of judgment. Those are the people who disbelieved and they took the prophets, وَاتَّخَذُوا آيَاتِي, my signs and my prophets, as a joke. I'm going to focus on this a little bit, right? Because I want to kind of look into this. Is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so he's scolding the disbelievers. In these verses, he's scolding the disbelievers, telling them that they think that the creation that they worship, starting from there, could help them from Allah on that day. They're not going to be able to. If they had thought logically about it, then about what they're doing, then they would realize their error. But they didn't do that. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that these individuals are the greatest losers on the day of judgment in terms of their deeds. It is those whose efforts are lost in this worldly life. So they're doing things. It's not that they're not doing it, but that effort is not accepted. Even though they think that they are doing good, that they're doing a lot of things. And one of the things we can look at is if you look at some of the people who follow other religions, right? Like the Christians, for example. Right? Some of the Christians, they do a lot of charity. They do a lot of good things. And they believe that they're doing good. And by the way, Allah would reward them, but in this world. On the day of judgment, there's nothing left. Right? So everything Allah is fair. He will reward them for everything that they're doing in this world. However, there is corner pillars for any deed to accept it, and that is being done for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and being done according to the sunnah. So it has to be sincere and correct for it to be accepted. And so it is because that they were following, essentially it's not that their deeds are not accepted, because in reality, rather than following Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they were following their own opinions and their desires. And so it's not accepted. And by the way, I know we're talking about the disbelievers or the non-Muslims, but this can also apply to the believers. Right? It can apply to the believers. For the non-believers, the non-Muslims, it applies at a greater scale that all their deeds are not accepted because it's not for Allah and it's not based on what Allah wants. But for Muslims, where does it apply? It applies in any time, for example, any part of our action is not sincere to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Or that it's not according to the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That will be rejected. And we think we're doing good. But in reality, it's not even accepted. And so we have to be very careful, even as Muslims, when we read these verses, it's not just towards the non-believers, but it's also for the believers to take heed of it and make sure that everything that we do is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and according to the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Tayyib. And by the way, this is the fitna of desire, because you're doing things based on your desire. This is the fitna of desire. When the wrongdoers are actually pleased with their action and heedlessness. The wrongdoers, they're usually pleased with their heedlessness and their actions, and they have zeal towards it, that they're defending it, and they're encouraging other people to do it. Because really, in reality, it coincides with their desire, right? It coincides with their desire, even if it goes against logic, even if it goes against evidence of the Quran and everything else, right? Sometimes, sometimes you see a certain action. Research shows that it leads to psychological damage, it leads to emotional distress, it leads to a lot of things. But yet they still want to do it. I'll give you a simple example. Alcohol. Alcohol. Any intelligent person can tell you that it is problematic. It is problematic. It can lead to addiction. It can lead to a lot of accidents happening. It leads to, research has shown it can lead to 6 different types of cancer. It ruins your organs, your liver. So many things that are very negative with it, but yet, it's not just that. It's celebrated. Anytime you want to be generous to a person, what do? Bring them a bottle of something. Anytime they want to celebrate, they open a bottle of whatever the case is, no matter what the celebration is. Okay? It's being promoted, whatever the case is. Okay? But this goes against logic. Like, all logic tells you that this is something that is not healthy, something that is not good. But because it fulfills a specific desire, all that is ignored. Now, this also applies to us as Muslims sometimes. We know certain things are wrong, but yet we indulge in it because it coincides with our desires. We have to be careful with that. So anyway, those individuals on the Day of Judgment, their deeds have no weight, okay, which reflects the insignificance of what their deeds were in the eyesight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there's no weight to their actions whatsoever. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informs us later on of the abode of those who believed. Inna a'tadna. What? After Jahannam, inna a'tadna Jahannam al-kafirina nuzula. And then, what's after that? Talking about the believers. You guys remember Surah Al-Kahf, right? طيب. What does it say? إن الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات كانت لهم جنات الفردوس نزلا. Right? Those who believe, Allah is coming what? إن الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات. Those who believed and did good deeds. كانت لهم جنات. For them there is gardens. Right? الفردوس نزلا. Nuzula, which means that they would land into it. This is their abode. خالدين فيها لا يبغون عنها حوجا. They will remain in it eternally, and they do not desire to move away from it. لا يبغون عنها حولا. Like, they're very content and happy with what they have. There's nothing else they would desire. You know, as human beings in this world, no matter how much what we have, we always look to something else. Why? We get bored. Right? We get bored of it. Right? Even if there's different variety, you want to always try the other variety that's there. But on the Day of Judgment, is there boredom? In Jannah, is there boredom? Why not? Because there's always ever increasing pleasure. The pleasure that we enjoy is always ever increasing. There's always more. There's always multiple different things that are happening. You're not looking at anything else. That's a reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A comment about that, just like, when we're talking about this, um, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, um, when He's talking about those individuals who believe, we have to understand that they didn't just believe, but they followed their belief with actions. They follow their belief with actions. This tells us that actions are important. Actions are important. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that if there's a Muslim that they don't, perform actions, that means that they're out of Islam. Of course, there's a debate about salah, but everything else does not mean they're out of Islam. But does that mean that they're, is their claim reflected in their actions? No. If we're honest about a claim, then our actions need to reflect it. Is that right? Quite often when we, I know, like in Egypt, this is like an Egyptian thing they usually say, right? They say my heart is pure. They did something. They said, no, it's okay, but because my heart is pure. Well, if our heart was pure, then our actions would also reflect it. When they say the Lord is the Lord of hearts, that is true, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also looks at your actions. They always quote half of the hadith, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَنظُرُ إِلَى صُوَرِكُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not look at your images, but looks at your hearts. But they forget the other part. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at your hearts and your actions. Or you look at your actions. This is why the Prophet ﷺ said that there is a morsel of flesh in the body. If it's sound, then the rest of the body is sound, which means the rest of all your actions will be reflected. And so this gives us a way to be able to weigh ourselves and measure ourselves. When we say that we are Muslims, that we are sincere, that we are righteous, do our actions reflect it? If our actions are not up to that level, we should consciously understand that we need to put in more work. That we're still not there yet. There's still a lot of other work that needs to happen. Inshallah, we'll get there, but not to be content and sit there and say, no, I'm good. Alhamdulillah, we're good. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only looking at my heart. This is not important. Allah will weigh my iman. Allah will all, that is all true, by the way. But with iman comes actions. With action comes iman. And with reduction of iman, there's a reduction of actions. And with reduction of actions, there's a reduction of iman. They're hand in hand. Right. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then informs us, قُلْ لَوْ كَانَ الْبَحْرُ مِدَادًا لِكَلِمَاتِ رَبِّي لَنَفِدَ الْبَحْرُ قَبْلَ أَن تَنْفَدَ كَلِمَاتِ رَبِّي لَوْ جِئْنَا بِمِثْلِهِ مَدَدًا. He informs us that there is essentially no limit to His words and to His knowledge. قُلْ لَوْ كَانَ الْبَحْرُ مِدَادًا لِكَلِمَاتِ رَبِّي. If the oceans were the source of ink for the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, لَنَفِدَ الْبَحْرُ. Then these oceans will be depleted. وَلَوْ جِئْنَا بِمِثْلِهِ مَدَدًا. Even if we came with those oceans multiple more. So this is referring to what? Referring to the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because Allah creates with kun. Be and it becomes. But it also can be meaning also with reflection to the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because it's all based on the knowledge and power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's reflecting that. And then the surah ends with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying, the Prophet said, قُلْ إِنَّمَا أَنَا بَشَرٌ مِثْلُكُمْ يُوحَى إِلَيَّ أَنَّمَا إِلَهُكُمْ إِلَهٌ وَاحِدٌ. Tell them that I am a human being, bashar, except that I receive revelation, and that your Lord is one. فَمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُ لِقَاءَ رَبِّهِ. So whomever desires his Lord, the meaning of his Lord, meaning the reward of his Lord, Wallahu a'lam, لِقَاءَ رَبِّهِ فَلْيَعْمَلْ عَمَلًا صَالِحًا. Let them perform good deeds. وَلَا يُشْرِكْ بِعِبَادَةِ رَبِّهِ أَحَدًا. Let them not associate in worship with their Lord. I want you to compare how this ends with how the surah starts. What does the surah start with? الحمد لله الذي أنزل على عبده الكتاب ولم يجعل له عوجا قيما لينذر بأسا شديدا من لدنه ويبشر الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات أنهم أجرا حسنا وينذر الذين قالوا اتخذ الله ولدا. Is there a relation between how it began and how it ended? I'm asking because there is. What is it? Huh? They're both clarifications of what the role and duty of the Prophet ﷺ is. Alhamdulillah الذي أنزل على عبده الكتاب. The Quran. ولم يجعل له عوجا. It's straight. There's no deviation in it. Why? لينذر بأسا شديدا. To warn, give a warning, but also give glad tidings. So abd, he's a slave of Allah, and this one, قل إنما أنا بشر. I'm a servant. Revelation, revelation. What is the job of the Prophet? It is to relay. There's a duty, right? To guide individuals, right? That he's a human being, but he receives revelation to guide people to that straight path. The path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to worship Him alone. Right? The first it talks about, and the last one it talks about. It's the same thing, right? Although it's mentioned in different ways, but the same message is there, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he has a specific role, that he's a human being, that he's sent as a guide to all of us to that straight path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that we should only worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, because this is what we need at the hereafter. There's reward and there is punishment. And so whomever hopes for that meeting with his Lord, let him do righteous deeds. Okay? And this is how the surah ends. So what are some of the lessons we can learn from this? I'm going to mention the first one, and you guys can start rolling, right? So one of the things that we can learn from this, as we're going, starting from the top of that last page, is that some people are still blind, no matter how much evidence is provided to them. No matter how much evidence you provide, they're still blinded. It is their hearts that are blind. It's not the evidence is not clear. The evidence is very clear. It is the hearts that are blind, and they're not listening. Right? Which means that they're not responding to that evidence. This is why we have to understand that our job is just to provide the evidence. The evidence is strong, it is there, it's very logical. But not everybody will accept it because they're blinded. Okay? Anything else? Say what? Action, good. So our iman is not complete without action, right? That reflects the iman, and the whole concept of not doing righteous deeds and claiming that you have a pure heart is not true. Okay? If you have a pure heart, it will be reflected in your action. That's good, excellent. Anything else? Yes, that is true. But I'm going to add something to it. So this has to do with the pillars of pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So the way to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that you're performing righteous deeds based on the sunnah, and it being sincere only for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So that's the third lesson. Anything else? Good and right is determined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His messenger. Not the humans, the ones that determine it. Where do you get this from? Is this when people do things and they think that they're doing good, when in reality it is not. So it also tells us without the guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we are lost. Without guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we are lost. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Hadith Qudsi, Ya ibadi kullukum dallun illa man hadayt fastahduni. All my servants, all of you are lost. Dal, you're lost, you're astray, except whom I've guided, so ask me for guidance. So without the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we are lost. Because He's the one that tells us what is good and what is bad. He tells us how to worship Him. He tells us what He wants us to be done. And the worst thing that could ever happen to us is that we exert so much effort in things and then discover at the Day of Judgment that it's not even accepted because we did not follow what Allah had ordered us to do. Or we did it for alternate reasons. Right? But yeah. طيب. Anything else? We should what? We should bless what we have. Oh, we should be thankful to what we have. Yes, we should be thankful for the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is true. But you don't get that from this page, the last end of it. I'm gonna mention something else, which is the importance of balancing between warnings and threats, reward and punishment. Like I said, well, balancing between warning and threats. So, or giving glad tidings and warnings. Essentially, it's balancing between fear and hope. Where this comes from is if you look at this last part, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the believers, disbelievers, Jannah and hellfire. Okay, you'll find that most of the time when the verses of the Quran mention the hellfire, it will always mention Jannah. Whenever it mentions Jannah, it will mention the hellfire. And so this is a balance. This balance is important. And we should not constantly focus on one without the other. Whenever there's mercy, there's also punishment. It's a balance. We have to make sure both are there because as human beings, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us and He knows what's best for us. And I'm saying this because a lot of times you'll find people, they either focus so much on Jannah and mercy and neglect talking about the hellfire and punishment. Don't scare the people. You're scaring the kids, right? You're making them lose hope. And then you have individuals that completely focus very much on fear and punishment and the hellfire and forget it's a balance. We have to have both. We should not be afraid of mentioning both. Right? We should not mention both. نبأ عبادي أني أنا الغفور الرحيم وأن عذابي هو العذاب الأليم. Inform my creation, my servants, نبأ عبادي أني أنا الغفور الرحيم, that I am the most forgiving, most merciful. And my punishment is the most severe of punishment. They're both there. We both need, as human beings, we need what encourages us, the carrot and the stick? We need the carrot and the stick. We need something to, encourage us, to entice us. But we also need something that we need to fear. Right? Both are utilized in different situations. Wallahu alam. طيب. I think that's all I have in terms of the lesson, unless somebody, if you guys have more insight. Wallahu alam. Any more reflections? Okay, brings me to the next part. Do we have dinner, Sheikh, right now? I think we do. We have 15 minutes. طيب. I want to discuss what we can, alhamdulillah, we finished, by the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, alhamdulillah, we finished Surah Al-Kahf. It's a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we're able to finish something from beginning to the end. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to reward all of us for it and to give us sincere intentions for being here, to accept from all of us. What do you guys want to take next? Or any suggestions for what we should cover next? Al-Ma'idah? That's a large surah. Let's take smaller ones with more stories. Maryam. People usually like Surah Maryam, Surah Yusuf, Al-Hujurat. What else is very popular? Huh? Yasin. I know those are popular. So, but all these are focused. They're all focused on the Quran. So, do you guys want to do something from the Quran again, or do you want to do something else? That's still from the Quran. We can. So let's divide them into themes, right? Continue with something from the Quran, or do you guys want to do something else? You guys want to do something from the Quran? Put together. I try to stay within 50 minutes, and I always go over time. So adding something extra is we can take as we're going through the Quran, take the lessons, apply certain things. But anyway, so there's a lot of ideas I had in mind that we can utilize this class for, right? And it can be a range of things. We can take anything from belief system, right? Whether it is we're talking about the Day of Judgment or the signs of the Day of Judgment or jinn or angels, some of those things that interest people, we can bring that in, or continue with the tafsir of the Quran, or talk about, for example, diseases of the heart, and its cures, or those are different things that usually people are interested in. There's a lot of information in it, but it's still something that is light a little bit at the same time, without being very intellectually detailed. Although I do admit sometimes I fall into that trap of going a bit more intellectual into things. Hopefully, inshallah, it's not too much and it's beneficial. But I can't help myself. It's just how my brain works. Wallahu a'lam. Continue with the Quran. Is everybody okay with that? That's not a series, ya Sheikh. That's a one-off topic. But we're also talking about, we have a series on Friday, so I'm talking about the stories of the prophets. We still haven't finished Musa alayhi salam. We haven't started back again since we stopped in Ramadan. But that's on Friday. We'll continue doing that, inshallah. But once again, so it seems like everybody wants to do something from the Quran. Is that true? I'll pick something. I just have to pick something that is, I gotta figure out my time frame. I want to pick something that is suitable with that. And alhamdulillah, all the stories in the Quran are beautiful. So either actually there's a lot of things we can do. We can talk about either specific surahs, or for example, parables from the Quran. There's a lot of parables that mention. We can start a series about the parables. We can start a series about descriptions of believers in the Quran, in addition to specific surahs. There's a lot of popular surahs that we can do. Once again, I think my intention is, inshallah, at least cover Al-Hujurat, Yusuf, and then that's from Yasin, or other things that are considered a bit more Abasa. Well, in this case, we can take a thematic approach to the 30th juz, all of it, because Abasa is only 2 pages. Yeah, it's true, but we can take juz amma, all of it. Start a thematic explanation of juz amma, all of it. Just so that we don't go into more of an analytical tafsir. It's more of a thematic tafsir. Hold on. خلاص, inshallah, we'll pick something from the Quran and we'll announce for it, inshallah. جزاكم الله خير.